What happens when a parent's love, the most nurturing force in the world, becomes a shield for something truly monstrous? When the desire to give your child everything, to protect them from every stumble, accidentally cultivates a darkness you could never have imagined. We're about to explore the fragile line between love and blind indulgence, and the monstrous secrets that can fester in the shadows. If you enjoy stories that delve into the complexities of human nature and the chilling consequences of our best intentions, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, settle in as we unfold the story of the Albright family and the secret that festered behind their perfect white picket fence. The Albright house was the envy of its idyllic suburban neighborhood. It was a pristine, two-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn, a tire swing hanging from an ancient oak tree, and a welcoming red door. From the outside, it was the picture-perfect embodiment of the American dream, home to the seemingly perfect Albright family. Richard, a successful architect, Helen, a devoted stay-at-home mother, and their only son, Julian. To their neighbors, the Albrights were a model of domestic bliss. They threw the most elaborate Halloween parties. Their Christmas lights were always the most dazzling, and Helen's homemade cookies were a coveted commodity at every school bake sale. But inside the walls of that immaculate home, a different reality was taking shape, one built on a foundation of unchecked indulgence that was slowly, imperceptibly, warping their beloved son. Julian was a beautiful child, with his father's sharp blue eyes and his mother's angelic blonde curls. He was doted upon from the moment he was born. No cry went unanswered, no whimper ignored. If he wanted a toy, he got it. If he didn't like his dinner, a new meal was prepared without question. Richard and Helen didn't see this as spoiling. They saw it as providing. Both had grown up with less, and they were determined their son would want for nothing. They called it giving him the best, a mantra that would later come to haunt them. The first signs were small, easily dismissed as childish quirks. At age 4, Julian had a screaming tantrum in a crowded supermarket because Helen wouldn't buy him a second chocolate bar. The tantrum itself wasn't unusual, but its intensity was. His small body trembled with a rage that seemed too immense for his frame. Helen, mortified by the stares of other shoppers, quickly placated him with the candy. "He's just tired," she told herself, brushing aside the flicker of unease in her gut. As Julian grew, so did his demands. His playroom overflowed with toys that were played with once and then discarded. He learned early on that the word no was merely a suggestion, one that could be easily overturned with enough screaming, crying, or a well-timed, dramatic sigh that could break his parents' resolve. Richard, busy with a demanding career, often assuaged his guilt for his absence with expensive gifts. A new gaming console, the latest sneakers, a top-of-the-line bicycle, these became substitutes for paternal guidance and discipline. When Julian started kindergarten, the problems began to spill outside their home. His teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Gable, requested a meeting with the Albrights just 1 month into the school year. She spoke of Julian's inability to share, his frustration when he wasn't the center of attention, and one particularly troubling incident where he had pushed another child off the swings because he didn't want to wait his turn. Helen listened with a tight, polite smile, her defensiveness rising like a shield. "Julian is a very sensitive and strong-willed boy," she explained, her tone brokering no argument. "He's just not used to being in such a large group. At home, he has all of our attention." Richard, ever the diplomat, added, "We believe in fostering his self-confidence. We don't want to crush his spirit with harsh rules." Mrs. Gable tried to explain that structure and boundaries weren't meant to crush a spirit, but to help a child understand how to function in a world that contained other people. Her words, however, fell on deaf ears. The Albrights left the meeting convinced that the teacher simply didn't understand their special son. That evening, to make up for the ordeal of the meeting, they took Julian out for ice cream. The monstrous secret wasn't born in a single, dramatic event, but nurtured in 1,000 of these small moments. It was in the way Helen cleaned Julian's room long after he was capable of doing it himself, because his sighs of protest were too much for her to bear. It was in the way Richard called Julian's soccer coach to argue for more playing time, instead of teaching Julian the value of earning his spot. A more significant crack in their perfect facade appeared when Julian was 7. The family got a golden retriever puppy named Buster, a fluffy, good-natured creature who adored Julian. For a while, it seemed like a positive step. But Julian's affection was possessive and often cruel. He would pull Buster's tail, delighting in the puppy's yelp of pain. He would commandeer the puppy's toys, and if Buster tried to retrieve one, Julian would shove him away with surprising force. Helen and Richard would intervene with gentle rebukes. "Be nice to Buster, sweetie," Helen would say, her voice soft and hesitant. But there was never a real consequence. They explained it away as boyish roughhousing. One afternoon, a neighbor's child, a quiet 6-year-old named Sam, came over to play. He and Julian were in the backyard with Buster. Helen watched them from the kitchen window, smiling. A few minutes later, she heard a sharp scream. She ran outside to find Sam on the ground, crying, with a bleeding scratch on his arm. Julian was standing over him, his face a mask of cold fury. Buster was cowering under a bush. "He tried to take my dog," Julian yelled, his voice shrill. Sam, through his sobs, explained that he was just trying to pet Buster. Panicked, Helen rushed to Sam, tending to his wound while trying to offer comfort. Richard ran out, and his first instinct was to comfort his own son. He knelt by Julian, who was now beginning to cry, sensing he might finally be in trouble. "It's okay, son," Richard said, wrapping his arms around him. "Tell Daddy what happened." Between fabricated sobs, Julian spun a tale of how Sam had been mean to Buster, pulling his ears, and that he was only trying to protect his puppy. It was a lie, a bald-faced and manipulative lie, but it was the story Richard and Helen chose to believe. They apologized profusely to Sam's mother, of course, but the apology was framed as an unfortunate accident, a misunderstanding between two boys. In their own home, Julian received no punishment. Instead, he was comforted, told he was a good boy for protecting his dog. The monstrous secret had been fed its first substantial meal. The lie was accepted, and the monster learned that his parents were not just protectors, but willing accomplices. The gilded cage they had built for their son was becoming a fortress, and they were the ones who handed him the stones. The years between Julian's 7th and 12th birthdays were marked by a steady escalation of what his parents privately referred to as incidents. Publicly, they maintained their perfect family illusion, but behind closed doors, a quiet, gnawing anxiety had taken root. The monstrous secret was growing, and with it, the complexity of the lies needed to conceal it. Julian had learned to master the art of manipulation. He could feign remorse with a disturbing skill, producing crocodile tears that could melt his mother's heart and convince his father of his sincerity. He became adept at twisting narratives, painting himself as the victim in every conflict. Other children were jealous of him, teachers didn't understand him, and rules were for ordinary people. This was the gospel according to Julian, and the Albrights were his most fervent disciples. The incident with the neighbor's cat was a turning point. The Millers, who lived 2 houses down, had a gentle elderly ginger cat named Marmalade. Julian, now 10, had always taken a strange interest in the animal, an interest Helen mistook for affection. One Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Miller came to the Albrights' door, her face pale and her hands trembling. Marmalade was missing. Helen offered her sympathies and promised to keep an eye out. She thought nothing more of it until 2 days later, when she was cleaning Julian's room. Tucked in the back of his closet, she found a small, mud-caked shoebox. A faint, foul odor emanated from it. Her heart pounding, she lifted the lid. Inside, lying on a bed of leaves, was the body of Marmalade. A wave of nausea and horror washed over Helen. This was not roughhousing. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something dark and deliberate. She slammed the lid shut, her mind reeling. For the first time, she was truly afraid of her own son. When Richard came home, she showed him the box, her voice a choked whisper. He stared at it, his face ashen. Denial came first, a desperate grasping for any other explanation. Maybe the cat was already dead, and Julian had found it. Maybe he was trying to give it a funeral. But when they confronted Julian, the cold, detached look in his eyes told them the truth. He didn't cry. He offered no excuses. He just stared at them and said, "It was making too much noise. I wanted it to be quiet." The chilling simplicity of his explanation shattered their defenses. This was a monster of their own making, a child devoid of the empathy they had failed to instill. That night, Richard and Helen faced their first true moral crossroads. They could do the right thing, tell the Millers, seek professional help for Julian, and face the consequences. Or they could protect him, protect their reputation, and bury the secret deeper. They chose the latter. Under the cover of darkness, Richard drove miles away to a wooded area and buried the shoebox. They told Julian, in no uncertain terms, that he was never to speak of it again. They didn't yell. They didn't punish him. Their fear was too great. Instead, they smothered him with even more indulgence, as if a tidal wave of love and gifts could somehow wash away the darkness they had just witnessed. They bought him a new, more expensive gaming system the following weekend. The monstrous secret was now an accomplice in a crime, binding the three of them together in a toxic, unspoken pact. School became a constant battlefield. Julian's grades were mediocre, not from a lack of intelligence, but from a complete refusal to apply himself. He saw homework and studying as beneath him. When a teacher gave him a poor grade, he would accuse them of being unfair, and his parents would storm the school, demanding a meeting with the principal. They became those parents, the ones teachers dreaded, who refused to see any fault in their child. In the 6th grade, Julian was caught cheating on a history exam. The evidence was irrefutable. But when the school called them in, Richard, the successful architect, used his professional charm and veiled threats to turn the situation around. He questioned the teacher's methods, the school's honor code, and even hinted at hiring a lawyer. The school, weary of the conflict and the Albrights' reputation, eventually backed down. Julian received a mild reprimand, and the teacher was left feeling demoralized and powerless. Julian had learned another valuable lesson. His parents' influence could bend reality to his will. His social life was a string of fleeting, superficial friendships. Kids were drawn to his family's wealth and the endless supply of gadgets in his room, but they rarely stayed long. They were put off by his arrogance, his need to always win, and his cruel sense of humor, which often involved humiliating others. Julian, however, never saw this as his failure. He would come home and complain to his mother that the other kids were boring or stupid, and Helen, desperate to maintain the illusion of her son's perfection, would soothe him, telling him he was just too special for them to understand. The monster was no longer just a secret. It was an active, malevolent force in their lives. It dictated their actions, warped their morals, and isolated them from their community. The perfect house with the red door was becoming a prison, its walls stained by the secrets they kept. Richard and Helen were no longer just indulgent parents. They were the terrified custodians of a monster they both created and feared, a monster who slept just down the hall, his face a perfect angelic mask hiding the cold void within. Adolescence descended upon the Albright household not as a gradual transition, but as a hurricane. The raging hormones and social pressures that challenge most teenagers were, for Julian, merely new tools with which to sharpen his manipulative and cruel tendencies. The monstrous secret, once a hidden entity, was now a tangible presence in their homey, a sullen, defiant teenager who regarded his parents not with affection, but with a mixture of contempt and utility. Julian, now 15, was tall and handsome, possessing a surface-level charm he could switch on and off like a light. He used it to his advantage, especially at school, where he cultivated a small clique of sycophantic followers who were impressed by his disregard for authority and the seemingly endless supply of cash his parents provided. He was the kid who always had the newest phone, who hosted the parties when his parents were out. In reality, they were often hiding upstairs, too afraid to confront him, and who seemed to coast through life without consequence. The incidents became more serious and more public. There was the time he was caught shoplifting a designer jacket, a crime his father paid the store manager to keep off the police report. Richard framed it as a misunderstanding, a foolish teenage dare. Julian was never punished. There was the cyberbullying campaign he orchestrated against a girl who had rejected his advances, a vicious and coordinated attack that left the girl ostracized and emotionally devastated. When the school traced the anonymous posts to him, Helen and Richard hired a lawyer who threatened to sue for defamation, and the matter was quietly dropped. With every transgression they covered up, the Albrights felt the ground beneath them crumbling. Their marriage, once a partnership, had become a business arrangement centered on a single, all-consuming project, managing Julian. They no longer had conversations. They had damage control meetings. The love and affection that had once fueled their indulgence had long since curdled into a potent cocktail of fear, guilt, and resentment. The point of no return came on a cold autumn night. Julian, who had just gotten his driver's license, took his father's expensive sedan without permission. He and two friends had been drinking at a party. On a winding country road, speeding and showing off, Julian lost control. The car careened off the road, slamming into a tree. The phone call came at 2 a.m. It wasn't from the police, but from Julian, his voice strangely, unnervingly calm. "There's been an accident," he said, as if reporting a spilled glass of milk. When Richard and Helen arrived at the scene, the flashing lights of ambulances and police cars cut through the darkness. One of Julian's friends had a broken arm. The other, a boy named Mark, had been thrown from the car and was unconscious, with a severe head injury. Julian himself had only minor scratches. At the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and fear was suffocating. While Mark's parents wept and prayed in the waiting room, the Albrights were in a private room with Julian and their lawyer. The reality of the situation was stark. Julian had been driving drunk, without a license for that time of night, and had caused a potentially fatal accident. Their lives were about to be shattered, but the monster they had created knew exactly what to do. With a clarity that horrified his parents, Julian began to construct the lie. He claimed that Mark had been the one driving. He said Mark had been drinking heavily and had grabbed the wheel. It was a complete fabrication, a cowardly act of self-preservation that would place the entire blame on the boy fighting for his life down the hall. Richard and Helen were trapped. To expose their son's lie meant condemning him, finally unleashing the consequences they had spent his entire life helping him evade. The legal and social fallout would be catastrophic. But to go along with the lie meant committing a profound act of moral cowardice, potentially destroying the life of an innocent boy and his family. In the quiet, sterile hospital room, they made their choice. They chose their son. They chose the secret. Their lawyer got to work, planting the seeds of Julian's story with the police. Richard and Helen went to Mark's parents, their faces masks of rehearsed sympathy, and offered support, all while knowing their son was the cause of this tragedy. Days turned into weeks. Mark remained in a coma. The police investigation, swayed by the Albrights' high-powered lawyer and Julian's unwavering, convincing testimony, began to lean in their favor. There were no other witnesses. Julian's other friend, intimidated by Julian and the influence of his family, corroborated the story. The monstrous secret had now consumed another family. It was no longer contained within their home. It had leaked out, a toxic sludge poisoning the lives of others. Helen stopped sleeping. She would wander the halls of their perfect house at night, the silence screaming in her ears. She would look at her beautiful son, who was acting as if nothing had happened playing video games, complaining about homework, and she would see a stranger, a hollow shell of the boy she thought she knew. Richard threw himself into his work, his days a blur of meetings and blueprints, anything to avoid the gaping moral vacuum that had opened up in his life. He had spent years building structures of steel and glass, but the foundation of his own family was rotten, and he was the one who had mixed the faulty concrete. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer just indulgent parents. They were criminals, accessories to a monstrous lie. They had sacrificed another child's future to protect the monster they had so lovingly, so blindly, created. The gilded cage had become a jail cell, and they were all prisoners, chained together by their terrible, unforgivable secret. The years following the accident were a hollow existence for the Albright family. They maintained their flawless exterior with a desperate, frantic energy. The lawn was still perfectly manicured. The holiday decorations were still the best in the neighborhood. But the joy was gone, replaced by a brittle, hair-trigger tension that permeated every corner of their model home. Mark eventually woke from his coma, but he was not the same. He was left with permanent brain damage that affected his memory and motor skills. His future, once bright, was now a painful landscape of therapy and dependence. Julian's lie, fortified by expensive lawyers and his parents' silence, became the official record. The case was closed, and the community, though it whispered, eventually moved on. The Albrights, through their wealth and influence, had successfully buried the truth. But the truth they were learning does not stay buried. It rots from below, poisoning everything above. Julian, now in his late teens, was emboldened by his ultimate escape from consequence. He viewed the world as his personal playground and other people as pawns. The monster no longer needed to be coaxed out. It was now his default state. He was a master of gaslighting, turning any criticism back on his parents. If they dared question his late hours, he would accuse them of not trusting him. If they balked at his extravagant spending, he would claim they were trying to control him. He used their guilt as a weapon, and they were powerless against it. Helen lived on a steady diet of sedatives, which smoothed the edges of her crushing anxiety, but did nothing to silence the screaming in her soul. She would sometimes see Mark's mother at the grocery store, a woman who had aged a decade in a few short years, and Helen would have to flee, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was haunted by the ghost of the woman she could have been, the mother she should have been. Richard's career, once his pride and joy, became his refuge and his prison. He took on more projects, traveled more frequently, and stayed late at the office. The silence in his car on the drive home was a brief respite before he had to walk through the red door and face the two strangers his wife and son had become. He and Helen were like two ghosts haunting the same house, their conversations limited to household logistics and the ever-present, unspoken topic of Julian. The monster had devoured their love, leaving only shared complicity behind. The first major crack in the mask came from an unexpected source. Julian got a girlfriend, an intelligent, kind-hearted girl named Chloe who, for a time, was completely taken in by his charm. The Albrights were ecstatic. They saw Chloe as a potential life raft, a force of good that might somehow fix their son. They showered her with gifts and welcomed her into their home, hoping her normalcy would be contagious. But Chloe was smart and perceptive. Before long, she began to see the darkness behind Julian's polished facade. She saw his flashes of rage over minor issues, his chilling lack of empathy for others, and the cruel way he spoke about his former friends. The final straw came when he told her about the car accident, bragging about how he had outsmarted everyone. He told the story not with shame, but with pride, as if it were a great personal victory. Horrified, Chloe broke up with him. Julian, who did not handle rejection well, went into a rage. He began to stalk her, sending her a barrage of threatening texts and emails. He vandalized her car. Terrified, Chloe and her parents went to the police. This time, there was no way to cover it up. The evidence was digital and undeniable. The Albrights were called to the police station, and for the first time, they faced a situation their money and influence couldn't immediately erase. A restraining order was issued against Julian. The whispers in their community became audible, damning conversations. The perfect Albright family was publicly disgraced. The monster, cornered, turned its rage inward, on the only people it could no longer control but still needed, its creators. The arguments in the Albright house became volatile. Julian would punch holes in the walls, his face contorting into a frightening mask of fury. He screamed at his parents, blaming them for his problems. "You're the ones who made me this way," he would bellow, and the horrible, unspoken truth in his words would leave them shattered and silent. One evening, during a particularly vicious fight about the restraining order, Julian advanced on his mother, his eyes blazing with a hatred she had never seen before. He backed her against a wall, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You were always so weak," he hissed. "You're pathetic." Seeing his son towering over his terrified wife, something inside Richard finally broke. The years of fear, guilt, and denial coalesced into a single, agonizing moment of clarity. This was not his son. This was a monster. The monster he had fed, protected, and armed. With a cry of primal rage, Richard launched himself at Julian, pulling him away from Helen. The two men, father and son, wrestled in the pristine living room, overturning furniture and smashing lamps. It was a clumsy, ugly brawl, fueled by years of repressed anger and toxic secrets. Helen could only watch, sobbing, as the two most important men in her life tried to destroy each other. The mask had not just shattered. It had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotten, decaying framework beneath. The monstrous secret was out, and it was tearing their world apart. The physical brawl between Richard and Julian was the final cataclysm that broke the dam of secrets. The violence in their living room was a raw, ugly manifestation of the poison that had been circulating in their family for nearly 2 decades. After they were separated, bruised and panting amidst the wreckage of their expensive furniture, a profound and terrible silence descended upon the house. The yelling was over. The lies were exhausted. All that was left was the cold, inescapable truth. It was Helen who spoke first, her voice raw from weeping. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, looking not at her husband or her son, but at the shattered pieces of a family portrait on the floor. "It's over." That night, for the first time in years, Helen and Richard talked. Not as co-conspirators in a cover-up, but as two broken people staring into the abyss they had dug for themselves. They spoke of the small choices, the ignored warnings, the willful blindness. They finally admitted to the monster they had created, piece by indulgent piece. The guilt was a shared, crushing weight, but in that shared admission, there was a flicker of something long absent: honesty. The next morning, Richard Albright did the 2 hardest things of his life. First, he told his son, Julian, to pack his bags. He was no longer welcome in their home. The monster, for the first time, was being served a consequence he could not evade. Julian reacted with predictable fury, threats, and manipulative attempts, but something had irrevocably shifted in his parents. Their fear of him was finally eclipsed by their fear of what they had become. When Julian realized his old tactics no longer worked, the rage gave way to a pathetic, weeping panic. He was being cast out of the gilded cage, and he had no idea how to survive beyond its walls. The second thing Richard did was walk into the town police station. He sat down with the chief of police and, with Helen by his side for support, he confessed. He told them the truth about the car accident from years ago. He recounted in painful detail how they had coached their son to lie, how they had used their lawyer to obstruct the investigation, and how they had knowingly let an innocent, injured boy take the fall. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The case was reopened. Richard and Helen were charged with obstruction of justice and perjury. The news exploded across their small community, a scandal that confirmed the darkest whispers that had circulated for years. Their friends abandoned them. Richard's business partners forced him out of his own firm. The beautiful colonial house, once a symbol of their success, became a monument to their disgrace, with news vans parked outside and reporters shouting questions whenever they dared to step out. Julian, now a legal adult, was charged with perjury and multiple offenses related to the accident. Stripped of his parents' money and influence, he was just another defendant facing the cold, impartial machinery of the law. The charm and arrogance that had served him so well were useless in a courtroom. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his own parents, he was found guilty. Sentencing day was a bleak, somber affair. Helen and Richard, having pleaded guilty, received sentences of community service and substantial fines, their reputations and careers in ashes. The true judgment was reserved for Julian. As the judge read his verdict and his sentencia multi-year prison term, Julian's mask of detached indifference finally crumbled. He looked at his parents, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. He, who had never faced a meaningful consequence in his life, was now facing the ultimate one. The monster was finally being caged. Months later, the Albright house was sold. Richard and Helen moved into a small, anonymous apartment in a different town. They were pariahs, but in a strange way they were also free. The suffocating weight of the secret was gone, replaced by the heavy but honest burden of their guilt. They began attending support groups for parents of troubled children, not to excuse their actions, but to understand them. One afternoon, Helen wrote a letter. It was a long, painful letter to Mark's parents, the Millers. In it, she did not ask for forgiveness, for she knew she deserved none. She simply told the truth, all of it, from the very beginning. She wrote of their foolish pride, their blind indulgence, and the monstrous secret that grew from it. She ended the letter with the sentence, "We failed as parents, and in doing so, we failed your son and we failed the world. We will live with that for the rest of our lives." She never received a reply. She didn't expect one. The damage they had done was irreparable. Their son was in prison. Another boy's life was irrevocably altered. Their own lives were a wasteland of their own making. The monstrous secret, born from a misguided love and nurtured by 1,000 small surrenders, had consumed everything, leaving only wreckage and a terrible, lasting lesson. The most monstrous things are not born in darkness, but are often cultivated in the blinding light of a parent's love.